It's time to Nephis and chill with yet another PvE class tier list for the Elder Scrolls Online in the year 2024. Last year, we actually made one specifically for the newer and returning players coming back to the game for the Necrom chapter, and since then, comments ranged between outrage and depression over people's favorite classes, so I want to make it super clear yet again with this video. These tier lists are subjective based on my decades worth of experience and observations in ESO at every level. I want to stress that when people keep asking me on my streams, hey Nephis, is class A or class B viable, or is playstyle C or D viable? The answer you always get from me is just always going to be yes, because ESO in the end comes down to your skill and accumulated knowledge and experience, along with the spending of time as a player or team. Will there be classes a little more ill fit for certain roles and certain raids, or will working out the math show some things are not as optimal as some other things? Well, yes, but does that mean trying to get results with those same things is impossible? I don't know, because that's really up to you, and that's really the fun of it. I love theory crafting, I love min-maxing, and I also love not min-maxing sometimes to play around with the stupidest looking things. I also love it when people just astound others with things people thought were impossible. So let not a random YouTube tier list video bar you from your creativity and efforts in pursuing what you want to achieve. So with that being said, this tier list will take into account mainly three things. First, ease of usage, like how easy or hard is the class to handle in exchange for the rewards or result yielding gameplay in certain content. Second, the popularity of the class, which is most of the time intrinsically tied in with what people would call the meta, but usually for things like raid compositions or itemizations for a team. And third, the numbers or math in terms of damage output, healing output, utility, passives, and so on that can make each class shine in the more obvious or different scenarios. Some people also wanted me to make a PvP tier list, but I scarcely PvP anymore, and when I do, it's in a slowly growing Gerwulf group on PCNA as of update 42. But I will still make passing PvP comments in regards to some of the classes or playstyles here and there, so definitely listen closely to parts of the video. I've also added Vampire and Werewolf to this tier list, even though they're not classes. I think some players, both old and new, will still appreciate some thoughts on them for PvE content, however. So first, let's start off with the best classes for Overland content. So I'm gonna, again, just to stress this again, because it is true. It all comes down to you as a player, and Overland is a very good example of that. I mean, you can play any class, any playstyle, any build, because Overland is not only so easy, but even in terms of the niche activities like soloing a world boss, or tackling on a world activity by yourself or with another person. It's just very accessible. I don't think you really need to optimize for Overland content. You don't really need to optimize your build or classes too much. You might need to swap out some skills here and there, or maybe swap out an item set, because a lot of the power does also rely not just on champion points or your class passives or your weapons, but a lot of it comes from your item sets themselves and what effects they have. So yes, delves, world bosses, world events, just general exploration, you can do it on any class, any playstyle, and even if you do die, it's whatever. You don't lose anything. Questing content, anything. You could probably AFK and be, for the most part, pretty fine. You probably won't die even if you AFK at certain points in Overland content. Now, obviously, some people point out that there are some world bosses that are gonna be a bit difficult to solo, sure, but I don't think it takes that much to theory craft to tackle on things. I mean, I have a video of me soloing a Sunspire dragon on the Templar. That doesn't mean Templar is the best, class for killing dragons. It just comes down to, can you kite it? Can you avoid the mechanics? Can you, kill it in a reasonable amount of time? Sure, go with whatever. Now, I do want to get on to the topic of soloing in, instance content. And there will be a few classes, I feel like, especially for Infinite Archive or the arenas, such as Black Rose Prison or Maelstrom Arena, which might see a bit of a more variance. So, for example, Maelstrom Arena, the power creep is so much that every class in there can do fine. Black Rose Prison, even, I think any class or, almost a lot of playstyles I've seen that have attempted and finished Black Rose Prison, or not Black Rose Prison, Balashran Arena, excuse me, Balashran Hollow, has also been fine. Now, we might see some things kind of deviate from that point with Infinite Archive. A lot of people thought, Arcanist, DK, and maybe even Templar, for example, might just be the best classes for Infinite Archive. Well, the most recent Infinite Archive world record in solo Infinite Archive by one individual called NDS, he used the Nightblade. So again, this is where things like, well, I thought it was going to be an Arcanist. No, he used a Nightblade. So there are things like that. But I want to kind of move on to DPS now in terms of PvE instance PvE content for dungeons and trials. So we'll tackle on dungeons first. Again, if you have kept up with my YouTube channel, you'll note that we've been doing a dungeon group that has been tackling on every single hard mode, speedrun, no death in every dungeon, from all the base game dungeons to the most recent DLC dungeons. We only have 2 dungeons left, and you'll notice that for the most part, we just kind of go with whatever. I went with Arcanist. So a couple of the other people went with Dragon Knight, or sometimes Templar, sometimes Arcanist, sometimes Warden Healer, sometimes Templar Healer. So, I mean, really, dungeons, it just comes down to awareness. It comes down to, depending on your group strategy, how much damage you can output. And I just would not try to, make a variance here. Some people would argue, well, Nightblade's so bad in PvE. Well, again, it just comes down to your experience level. So for DPS and trials, however, there is going to be a greater differences in how we look at things, because trials, 12-man raids, you have to take into consideration raid itemization, raid composition. You also take into account DPS output, especially for the harder content, or maybe you want to make the harder content a little easier by skipping certain mechanics, by pushing a boss past a certain health percentage or to a certain health percentage. Famous examples are Teleria, Asylum Sanctorium, with Olm's jumps. There's also things where you can just, make the fight infinitely easier by just killing things much faster. I mean, every trial has an example of this, so yeah. For DPSing trials, unfortunately, werewolves will probably go like D or C. So a lot of the power from werewolves up until update 41, or I haven't really tested werewolf this patch for PvE because I'm more focused on PvP. I think PvP, it's slowly going to become more and more annoying, especially in groups of werewolves, which is why I've been doing so. But werewolves in PvE have been kind of suffering for a while. I would say it's probably one of the more just not so great playstyles in terms of output. I mean, you can do it. You can tank as a werewolf in dungeons or trials. You can try the DPS, but a lot of the power for werewolf in PvE comes from single target light attacks with Reliquin being equipped, and when you compare that to the potential cleave offered by Dragon Knights or Arcanists, or even ultimates that you can use with Nightblade, like Destro ulti or even Incap, I just do not see werewolf as greatest option for trials as a DPS. Can you do it in the older content? Absolutely, go for it. But now I'm talking from both the popularity numbers and the ease of use perspective. Is it easy to use? Yeah. Are you gonna get a lot out of it? Probably not. Is it popular? No, and there's a reasons why, and it's just not great, unfortunately. I hope they revisit werewolf for PvE. I think it's been a while. I mean, I think the last great time it had, besides right now maybe, in PvP even, was in 2020 with, Greymore up until Markarth patch. So yeah, it's not looking so hot for Werewolf DPS. Can you do it? Yes, go for it. Vampire. So Vampire is an interesting one. Vampire is not like, like Werewolf, where you just transform into a vampire and that's your only skills. No, you can be a vampire while you're in your original form. You can actually use vampire skills while you're in human form as a sorcerer, or humanoid form as a sorcerer, or whatever. There are definitely use cases for a couple of their skills, including boosting your weapon and spell damage by sacrificing a bit of health. For tanks, invigorating drain to gain ultimate. So I mean, it's just very niche. It's also very case dependent. So I'll put it at like C or B. Now, as for the best DPS for trials in terms of damage output, popularity, ease of usage, undoubtedly it is Arcanist, and you can't possibly mess up Arcanist. Even if you're a new player, I feel like it's just so straightforward. There isn't a lot of room, as opposed to like Nightblade, which has which can have a much more complex rotation at times depending on the fights. It doesn't really leave much room for mistakes, and even if you do mess up, you can easily get that DPS back. But yeah, I mean, in terms of usage, ease of usage, very easy to use, high damage yield, more results essentially. It's very popular because it has a lot of cleave just from the beam, and there are important parts of very hard fights like Teleria, or even on Soul Hard mode in Sanity's Edge, where it's like, yeah, you definitely need some cleave from these guys to make ad management or mechanics a little easier on the group, which is essential for surviving and doing a trifecta and getting the endgame stuff. So Arcanist, definitely S tier. Next to Arcanist, I would probably put, honestly, Templar. This might be controversial, but I think Templar, with the beam alone and the synergy offered by Purify for Outcast users and so on, the beam alone is insane, especially for the extremely high health bosses when they enter beam phase execute. Like, it's just insane. I've seen the Templar DPS when I'm an Arcanist DPS. If they're like 20k below me, they'll not only catch up, but they'll surpass me during execute. And there's a significant difference when you take, let's say, for example, 2 Arcanists, 1 Templar to Portal Room in on Soul Hard mode, versus 2 Templars and 1 Arcanist DPS into Portal Room on Soul Hard mode. And the 2 Templars and 1 Arcanist is much faster, in my opinion. So mathematically, I would say, and popularity wise too, for even certain trials like Asylum Centurium, I would say Templar is very, very good, and I would highly recommend it to anyone trying it out as a DPS to just keep kind of improving on it. As for the next few classes, well, Nightblade for trials, well, this is kind of where things get a little muddy. Nightblade is very, very strong right now, especially in PvP, whereas conversely, just like with Warden, it's not too great for PvE in terms of, for example, easy usage in relation to reward. Like, again, why would you want to? I mean, again, if struggling and hard work for maybe almost as much reward as other classes is your kink, go for it. Whatever. But Nightblade, to me, as a DPS, offers little to no. Not little to no, but like not as much as an Arcanist or even a Templar. I really wish they could somehow make it strong for PvE without it affecting PvP. So that's really the problem here, right? So I would definitely put Nightblade in C tier for trials as a DPS. For DKs, I'd still put it at S tier. Not too much has really changed since last year, except of course Arcanist kind of overtook DK in a lot of scenarios for trials. But you still need, you can still do really great with DKs, and you still have usage cases for Zen DK. Sorcerer also really, I mean, I think the latest couple patches, I've honestly put Sorcerer at also S tier, 100%. So I would also recommend Sorcerer, especially, I mean, single target wise, they can be pretty insane, especially in the hands of a really good player. So yeah, Sorcerer, and also you do need at least one Sorcerer for a group for the minor. So S, A, I mean, wherever you want to put it, I feel like there could be at times gradients of S or A, right? So here we go, Necromancer. So Necromancer could be B or A, depending on your group composition for trials, or even your itemization like Lucent Echoes if you don't need Elemental Catalyst, and if you don't need Elemental Catalyst, well then you don't really need potentially 2 Necros depending on the content. So I'd still put it at A tier though, tier A. It's a bit lacking though in terms of like, personally I do not enjoy Necromancer DPS, and I know there are some freaks out there who actually do love the Necromancer class, no offense, but I just really wish they improved the class a bit more. I think some of the changes recently were a bit too lacking or not desirable by a lot of Necromancer players I've talked to. So I'll put it somewhere between A or B, just because of the utility alone, and also you may need to actually use it. So Warden is also kind of in the same boat as Nightblade. Can you bring 5 Warden DPS to a raid and still do great? And can you still get Godslayer and things like that up in whatever? Yeah, absolutely. Mathematically though, but also like, no, not mathematically, sorry. In terms of like enjoyment, it just may not be, or usage, it just may not be so great. So it's somewhere between B and C. Honestly, I feel like it's still a little off. It's a little better off than Nightblade in a lot of these scenarios that I can think of in my head for trials as a DPS. But that's really it. This is it. S tier, Arcanist, Templar, S tier, DKS, Sorcerer S. Warden could arguably be A, B. Necromancer could be A or B. Nightblade's, in my opinion, is C, and the Werewolf is definitely a D. And Vampire can kind of overlap with a lot of things, but there are use cases and niche scenarios where you could be a vampire. All right, so for healers, this might even be a little bit murkier than DPS, because for healers, you could argue for things like healing output or utility, whether it's defensive utility or offensive utility. You could also argue for things like, well, what about minors, like minor toughness from Warden? And again, this all just comes down to what your group wants from you as a healer, because if you're a healer, I'm assuming you have a group of some kind, whether it's for dungeons or for Dragonstar Arena or something, or trials, right? In PvE. So yeah, it's gonna be a bit more murky, but at the same time for dungeons, again, just like how it was for DPS, for the most part, you will be fine, you know, as whatever. Really, as whatever class. Templar healer, great. You know, Arcanist healer can be great too. Nightblade healer arguably has a stronger healing output than a couple of the other classes. Dragon Knight healing, you know, I think a lot of actually healers secretly love. A lot of healer mains secretly love Dragon Knight healing. So yeah, you can, you know, whatever. You know, dungeons, DLC dungeons, you know, DLC dungeon hard modes, DLC dungeon trifectas, go for it. You know, Warden 2, great. Can you be a vampire doing that? Yeah, sure, whatever. The only thing I would probably say is kind of meh is the Werewolf. I have yet to still find someone or a build where they can heal others effectively as humanoid form characters as a werewolf. I'm sorry, Werewolf fans, but Werewolf is in the D tier on this one. Now for trials, again, there will be a greater deviation. So for trials, you could argue, oh, healing output. What about, you know, Templar, Arcanist, Nightblade, Warden, and so forth. Well, what about utility? You could argue Necromancer too, maybe. You could definitely argue Warden. You could also say, for example, maybe if in scenarios where there's a lot of trash, you could potentially consider a Necromancer healer. I've seen some groups try it out for Lucent Citadel, which features a lot of trash fights. So yeah, there's a lot of things to consider here. But in terms of, I think, in terms of like the group composition for trials and stuff like that, we do have to take that into consideration in terms of popularity for why it is. And of course, just kind of like common sense with some of the things you may need. For example, it's probably best to have a warden healer, at least one warden healer of the 2 healers you are usually allocated for a raid team of 12. Minor toughness, healing output's great, and they can help sustain the group too. But a lot of that can come from items such as well. Templar can be fine too, although usually a lot of groups seem to opt for Arcanist and the Warden combo rather than the Warden and Templar combo. I personally have not seen too many sorcerer healers outside of the mini trials and some very niche strats. So I would probably put sorcerer healing at C, DK healing, like on a personal level, S tier. But on on a more objective level, I put it at C, or I probably put it at C or B depending on the content. Right. For Necromancer healing, it could be anywhere from, again, depends on the content or whatever you're trying to do. Anywhere from A to C. Nightblades. So healing up for Nightblades can be actually pretty strong, but usually in a lot of the content, especially the older content, too much overhealing isn't typically needed. You could also argue that in terms of utility, Nightblade could be up there in A, below the Arcanist utility offered for defenselessness, or Templar utility even might be, worse than Nightblade in terms of defensiveness. So Nightblade, though, in general, it's had its ups and downs throughout the history of ESO. So I could put it somewhere between B or C. This is the problem with tier lists, where like you can do it, and of course it will depend on things your group wants to do or mess around for fun. But in terms of like numbers, in terms of popularity, in terms of the ease of usage, I would definitely put it at like C or something for sure. But also, in regards to dungeons, actually kind of backtracking to the dungeon part, it also might come down to damage, right? Because for a lot of content and for a lot of boss fights, your healer can get away with doing more than just standing there and healing and buffing. They can also damage too. And this can also come down to item sets or specific fights. So this tier list could change just based on that, right? So yeah, that's basically it for healers. Again, just comes down to what your group needs or wants. And again, typically it's usually Wardens, Templars, Arcanists. At the end of it all, this would be my final tier list for healers for trials. Warden, Templar, Arcanist at the top. After that, Nightblade, and after that, DK and Necromancer and Sorcerer. And of course, dead last is the Werewolf. All right, last but definitely not least is our tank brothers and sisters. So for tanking in dungeons, again, just like with everything else so far, you can tank basically everything as any class, as long as you can outfit yourself correctly or use the appropriate skills. If you're having a lot of trouble, for example, you're probably going to have a lot of a harder time in maybe Frostfold as a Templar tank compared to a DK tank. So obviously you can look for ways around it. Dungeons aren't really they're not supposed to be impossible, regardless of what class you play. And of course, the degree of difficulty will increase the more you get into, veteran trials or hard mode trials. So there are going to be a lot of ways for you to do things as whatever tank. The only thing, I guess, is maybe between C or D is going to be Werewolf. Werewolf tanking, it's very possible now, even without the Tormentor set, because they've now, as of update 42, or the Gold Road chapter, made it so that if you're a pack leader, you also, or werewolf, you also have the ability to taunt while in werewolf form. So you can taunt in werewolf form, just like you could taunt in humanoid form now, even without the set. And arguably, without the Tormentor set, you are better off, because you could do another survivability set or another group utility set in place of a Tormentor set that allowed you to use your Pounce as a taunt. Well, now that taunting is official in Werewolf now, per the developers' additions to it, I'd still say Werewolf tanking, can it be fun? Can you do it? Absolutely, but compared to the humanoid form tanking, as whatever other class, and as a non-werewolf, it's still C or D tier, in my opinion. But yeah, when we get to hard modes, there will be a few classes that will make things easier. For example, Nightblade tanking can be really great in dungeons. Dragon Knight tanking can be really great. Necro tanking can be really great. Arcanist tanking can be really great. Even Sword tanking could prove to be actually easier than Necro tanking in some instances for some of the DLC hard modes. Warden tanking can be done in both trials or dungeons, and often it is more niche or group dependent, whether you want to use it for like Black Forest Prison or maybe some just because you want to use it. But like if I had to put it in terms of I guess ease of usage for either dungeons and trials, I think Warden, Sorcerer, Templar will probably be B tier. And of course, Vampire, just like with healers or DPS, can kind of like overlap on certain things. I'll put it in C tier for now, because this is also very niche for tanking, like things like Cloud Rest or even some DLC hard modes. You might want Vampirism for a couple of the skills, or you could try Mist Kiting on Vrol in Kind's Aegis, if that's still a thing at this point. But that's also not really needed. If you want to kite that AoE out further, but I digress. You can be B or C. If you want to be Vampire, doesn't really matter. It's up to you, up to the strats you want to do. But this is probably what I would say is for like just dungeons in general. Not that you can't do all the dungeons again, you can do whatever, right? But in terms of easy, like just kind of easy handling, there's no shame in it, by the way. When I say it's like, oh, it's easier to do this on DK, it's fine, it's okay. But DK tanking, very common for a reason. They're just really a solid tanking class. Arcanist, I hopping onto an Arcanist tank for the first time, I was like, can people really die like easily? I think it can be very on par with DK tanking, depending on the content. Nightblade tanking, again, a lot of the strengths of Nightblade lies in PvP, and PvP you have access to a lot of the Nightblade's mitigations and healing capacity. So it's just like Nightblade tanking in PvE can also be pretty good. Necromancer tanking, also a common thing in both dungeons and trials. But let's go more into trials at this point, because we're still kind of looking at it from the dungeons perspective. So this would probably be for dungeons. Trials, still S tier. Dragon Knight, Arcanist, Necromancer for sure. I would say Nightblade is somewhere between A or B. Sorcerer is somewhere between A or B as well. Anything that's not a DK tank, Arcanist tank, or Necro tank isn't very popular to use, or if they are used, they tend to be in very specific fights or specific scenarios or very specific group compositions for different pieces of content. So in the end, this is probably my tier list for, the tanking classes in PvE for trials for 20-man raids in particular. So definitely at the top, DK, Arcanist, Necromancer, A or B, Nightblade, Sorcerer, B or lower, Templar, and Warden. So yeah, this is it. If you expected more hot takes, well, I'm sorry. So again, obviously, this tier list is subjective and based on my personal experiences and opinion. But if you have any suggestions, or if you disagree, or if you agree, or you have any thoughts as to what the tier list for each class looks like in terms of their respective roles for PvE or certain categories of PvE, let me know down in the comments below, and let me know what your favorite class is as well, if you want, or what you would love to see come to your class or your preferred class, or any class really, in The Elder Scrolls Online. Until next time, or next year maybe, for the next tier list video, I'll see you guys next time. Stay safe.